In the chaotic month since Donald Trump assumed office, he appointed cabinet members who, aside from spreading conspiracy theories and calling Trump Hitler, lacked any real experience. Last week, these individuals were sent to Europe, where their speeches at the Munich Conference left even the most loyal MAGA Republicans baffled. It has become ever more apparent that Europe must begin to view itself as a unified entity, free from being entangled in US foreign policy decisions made by people whose moral compass is deviating so far from our own. Not only is our economy on par with the US economy, we have a bigger population pool, better education, rank generally much better on any index you can think of, and we don't let South African billionaires ruin our states, all the while receiving billions of US dollars in state subsidies to his own companies. I'm Tuomas, a former officer in the Finnish Defense Forces, and in this episode we'll discuss a roadmap for Europe to become the independent superpower it needs to be now that we've got one authoritarian to the east and another emerging in the west who sacrificed the alliances that his forefathers built through blood, sweat and tears in just a month in office. We'll look at how Europe should take command of the European chapter of NATO, what it should do with Ukraine, and lastly how we have to stop being reliant on the 4-year schizophrenic election system in the US. First, let's address the elephant in the room. In his speech the other day in Munich, US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth all but admitted that they've given away most of their negotiation cards to Putin and Russia before even starting talks. He said Ukraine wouldn't be part of NATO. He said Ukraine must make concessions, and he said that the US will no longer support Europe conventionally. Shortly thereafter, Trump's team said that Europe and Ukraine would not be part of the negotiations, and then Trump himself had to row this back a day later and admitted Ukraine had to be part of the negotiations in some way. And then Pete Hegseth realized what a mistake he'd made and tried to polish the surface of the turd he had uttered a day later. With important US figures quite clearly flip-flopping between improvising America's positions on the spot and the more calm and collected approach of Keith Kellogg and Marco Rubio, I think a line in the sand needs to be drawn. If there ever was a time for European nations to step up and donate to Ukraine, this would be it. While Europe has given more to Ukraine than the US as a whole, there are some countries who are yet to dip very deep into its pockets. Exclude the Baltics, Poland, Czechia, the Nordics, Netherlands and the UK, and there's a lot of countries who frankly could and should do more. Countries who aren't on Russia's borders, who have a lot of gear in storage, should now understand that this is it. Spain, Italy, Germany, to some extent France, Belgium and so forth could and should do more. It is only through force that Ukraine will have a good hand in the negotiations, and ideally at least some of the thousands of armored vehicles in deep storage in France, Spain and Italy need to be refurbished and sent to Ukraine with a matter of urgency. And the same has to be said about Germany's long-range Taurus missile arsenal. Sadly, I think it is time to consider Article 5 less relevant. It was only ever the US who used it anyway, and since World War II, it has become clear that it is often Europe who comes to America's aid rather than the other way around. Yes, I know that this statement will have the MAGA cult going nuts in my comment section, but at this point I think we need to look at reality. Ever since Korea, Europe has come calling whenever the US wanted to feed its military-industrial complex with war, starting with Vietnam, then with Iraq 1 and 2, and lastly Afghanistan. It hasn't ever been Europe who has needed NATO, it was always the US. Coincidentally, two of the nations Donald Trump is now threatening, Canada and Denmark, both lost as many or more soldiers per capita as the US in America's last eternal war in Afghanistan, where America's allies bled and sacrificed only for the US to turn tail and run. Going by Hegseth's comments, America won't be committed to a conventional response to Article 5 anymore, which essentially renders NATO with the US in it a rather useless entity. While it appears that even Trump reacted to these comments and said he thought Hegseth spoke out of turn, it lays bare the sort of mind-boggling foreign policy course which the US is now set to take. Europe now faces an imminent question. Do we let Ukraine fall based on bad faith negotiations between Russia and the US? Or do we stand up for Ukraine? I know which side my own country Finland is on, and frankly I've never had such a united European response from everyone except for the Putin lovers in Hungary and Slovakia. So how could Europe as an entity flex some muscle to make it become included in the peace talks in order to have Ukraine's back? First of all, it appears that both France and Great Britain seems to have woken up and smelled the coffee. The first thing that should be done would be to send contingents of peacekeepers to Kyiv, Zaporizhia, Dnipro, Odessa, and Lviv. That way Europe is showing that we're not going to let Ukraine fall. It also adds a different layer to Russia's planning. Do they risk firing missiles at troops from nations who at this moment has pretty well stocked arsenals compared to their own seriously depleted armed forces? These troops could effectively take over tasks already done by Ukrainian troops, which would free up men from the West to go and enforce Ukraine's active sectors. While they may not be the world's largest nuclear programs with a total of around 500 nuclear warheads, the UK and France need to get together and discuss what to do about their nuclear deterrence programs. 500 warheads may not sound like much, but it is as many nukes as China operates, and more than enough to wipe Russia or any potential enemy off the map. And as North Korea has shown, having a credible nuclear response is the only way to ensure that you're not invaded. Ideally, I'd like to see a reboot of Sweden's nuclear program too, so that we have 3 nuclear-capable entities in the EU. Sweden could likely have their program up and running within months, as they already worked on a program from 1945 all the way up to 1972. It famously only took France 2 years to develop their program in the 60s, and while I'm sure people will protest, the mere mention of developing nuclear weapons is a deterrence in itself, and the Nordics would likely be a solid, stable part of Europe for another nuclear arms program. Most of all, it is time to up our military spending in Europe. As we've tried to communicate on this channel for weeks now, this investment should ideally go into European weaponry and jobs. Europe has the capability to buy everything that we've spent billions of euros on in the US, like aircraft, anti-air systems, tanks, missiles, and so forth. Furthermore, it might be time to consider what to do about the countries who have not yet received their F-35 orders. Trump is already signaling that he wants to sell the F-35 to India, and as soon as India receives this technology, it'll end up in the hands of Russia in a heartbeat. We cannot be dependent on a US who without thought sacrifices an edge that we were oversold by the US in such a brazen act. It is time for the fighter jet producing nations of Europe to come together and decide what to do here. And ideally, in the future, we'll operate 3 European variants, one heavier variant like the Rafale, one lighter variant like the Gripen, and one carrier variant which could be made by the Eurofighter program, rather than relying on delivery from an increasingly unstable and untrustworthy US. It's been a bit of a surreal week. For myself, being a former officer in the Finnish Defense Forces, I was happy when my nation joined NATO, along with Sweden in 2023. But that doesn't mean that I think NATO should be used as a platform for the US selling their hardware and projecting war into the Middle East. As both Finland and Sweden have shown for 80 years, it is more than possible to maintain a deterrence without having a US bully at your back. And from what I gather, many people in Europe are waking up to this realization with the clown show going on in America's top positions at the moment. Hopefully, our leaders discussed concrete steps at their emergency meeting yesterday, including Europe's nuclear deterrence, a European armed force, support for Ukraine, and the fact that someone will need to spill some truths to our American so-called allies. Last but not least, to our Canadian viewers, we feel for you. You essentially at this point live in the apartment above a meth lab. Europe is more than willing to deal, trade, and accept you into our cooperative sphere. But I don't envy your location at the moment. Stay strong, and remember that the last time the US and Canada fought a war in 1814, you burned down the Capitol and White House. America will do well to remember its history.